Welcome to On Top of PR with Jason Mudd, presented by Review Maxer.
Hello and welcome to On Top of PR. I'm your host, Jason Mudd with Axia Public Relations. And today we're talking about best practices for mutually beneficial, long-lasting media relationships. And our guest today is David Triana, also of Axia Public Relations, where he is the Director of Media Relations. David has helped clients earn media coverage in a variety of industries. And he's also been mentioned in media outlets, including Business Insider, Daily Mail, and Forbes, where he's given commentary on public relations profession and how to get media coverage. So with that, I want to welcome David to the show.
Thanks, Jason. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here too, and excited to share with our audience some of your best practices. So, David, you've been recognized as one of the top media relations professionals in America, and that's one of the reasons we're really glad to have you on our team, not to mention you're just a good guy overall. David, how did you land in PR?
So, funny thing, originally the job that I interviewed for was a writing position, but then I was asked, hey, we have a lot of writers on staff. What do you think about delving into PR? I had no idea what that would turn into, but at the time, getting out of the COVID era, just needed work. I was like, okay, let's try it. My experience beforehand was all journalism related, so just doing freelance work and things like that. And then it just fit like a glove. Immediately, I was lucky enough to have some really great clients, and it was. What I've noticed is people that come from the journalism field that go into PR just have an innate understanding of how that job is supposed to, go and how you're supposed to interact with the media. It was kind of a happy accident, and I've been in the industry for the past 3 years.
Yeah, David, I completely agree that the best media relations professionals are ones that have been in a newsroom, understand the environment and the pace, the challenges, and kind of just I wouldn't say the culture, but the high expectation, the fast pace, and what really is the target or the type of stories that the reporters are looking to cover. I think a lot of times people just say, oh, I got a great story because either, the people inside my company laugh when I tell it, or the people inside my company seem to care about it. But the truth is, when you're talking about media relations and earned media, it matters what people think outside of your organization, if it's interesting and relevant to them.
Exactly.
You made another good point, and I think it's worth repeating in that, again, the best media relations professionals are those that have worked in newsrooms. But at the current rate, there's something out there like PR people are currently outnumbering journalists like 6-1, I think is what I read recently. And what I'm noticing is we're hiring entry-level PR professionals. They have almost zero newsroom experience. And that's because there's just not as many jobs in journalism for them to start out in. But I guess my question to you might be, what would be a prescription or a recommendation you would give someone who wants to be successful earning media coverage, but has not yet ever worked in a newsroom? Are there hacks or tricks or shortcuts you might offer, David?
The thing that I would say is, like, the way that I did it was I just kind of dove into it. I think if you start to think about it too much and you start worrying about making a mistake or not necessarily knowing how to go about the interaction with a client, how those steps need to go, I find that you're just going to be even more nervous and not necessarily know how to do it. So I think if you have just any understanding of how to interact with people, I would just dive into it. The way that I got into it, obviously it wasn't even for PR. So I think a lot of people that are looking for work, I think they have a chance if you can show your willingness to learn, first of all, your ability to communicate and have, interpersonal relationships, and then not being afraid to fail. I think that is the most important thing and the most important attribute you can have as a PR professional. The story I always tell is, I think in my first month, I accidentally sent out a pitch that just said hi to just a lot of top tier journalists. Growing pains you have to get through. But for people coming out of school or just really not having a good sense of direction of where they want to go in the industry, just dive into it. Start at the bottom, work your way up. And if you don't like it, that's unfortunate, but at least you gave a shot.
Yeah, I think that's really important. In fact, I've recently had a conversation with somebody in our organization that I'm mentoring and just said, hey, I want you to feel comfortable failing forward, like make some mistakes, take some risks. And it's really easy when the risks you're taking are only internally, meaning that you're writing something and your supervisor is going to see it anyway. Take some risks. It's okay if you don't have all the information. It's okay if you don't have it perfectly right, but I'd rather see you get something 80% done with a few holes in it than sitting back and waiting to even start it, or only getting 1/3 of the way done until you have a chance to access either the client or your supervisor or somebody who's going to give you more input.
Right.
A couple of thoughts I have, a couple of tips I have, David, for somebody in that situation we just described would be one, get yourself invited to or attend some sort of newsroom media tour. Print newsrooms have gone mostly virtual, and or their staff just seems to be almost non-existent. But the TV newsroom and the radio newsroom is still pretty well staffed with people. And I think just walking through the newsroom, seeing how it's departmentalized, like here's sports, here's, general assignment desk, here's where the anchors sit, just kind of the producers are, the news director and the assignment desk is just kind of, for me, at least I'm a visual person. I went to the University of Missouri, so the show me state. So I'm always telling people to show me stuff so I can see it and visually understand it. But for me, it kind of just helps me in my mind walking through that newsroom to being like, okay, who am I pitching? What is their environment like? Who do they sit next to? How busy are they? It just kind of really helps me crystallize, like, I've got to be clear. I've got to be concise. I've got to be smart. I've got to be brief. And the other thing that I think is a really good tip is, just studying the media, studying news and what gets covered and which way and why and how. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a lost art as well, is that people are trying to pitch a, magazine, newsletter, show of some sort that they've never even consumed on their own, and therefore they don't really relate to it and they don't really see examples. So, that's something I recommend as well. Did you have any other thoughts to add to that?
No, the only other thing that I would say is research is so important. Because as you just mentioned, if you're pitching a news station or a show, any sort of media outlet that you've never even read an article, you've never watched a show, you have no idea how they operate, a journalist is going to see your pitch and just immediately be like, okay, this is not targeted to me. They have no idea what I cover. They have no idea what we're about. My email is clogged up as it is. I'm not going to waste my time. They're going to hit delete and they're never going to read your pitch. So my advice is always quality over quantity. Take the time, research, understand who you're pitching, what you're pitching, and be as concise as possible.
Yeah, a couple of months ago, you and I were talking, you might remember this, but we kind of agreed that, like, in baseball, a Hall of Famer is going to bat 300, right? And in media relations, I think we mutually agreed it's kind of the same thing. Like, if 1 in 3 of your pitches land, then you're pretty good at what you do. And I think that's a helpful kind of metric for me to share with clients, especially potential clients, when maybe they've never hired a PR firm before, or they've been disappointed with their past, PR firm experiences. I kind of describe to them that environment that, hey, if I go to the Wall Street Journal and I pitch them 3 times and they say yes 1 out of 3 times, then I'm doing a pretty good job. The next thing, though, I think we have to say is like a precaution, because I know there's entrepreneurs who are listening to this podcast, or who I've said that to, who go, okay, so in other words, we need to be pitching the Wall Street Journal 100 times. So then we get coverage, 30 times. I'm like, nope, that is not the right approach either, because guess what? That Major League Baseball player didn't have an artificial number of additional at bats, right? He or she, but mostly he, right, had to bat in a particular order with 8 other players on the team in a particular order. So it's not the at bats necessarily that hurt or help, but instead it's being selective about the things that the pitches that you swing at, or the pitches that you take or decide not to take. And I think that's one of the keys of really good media relationships, is not taking a pitch to a contact in the media just because your boss or the CEO said to or wants to.
Yeah, you have to show discretion. You have to understand that you are the professional in this situation. You are the one that is, for lack of a better term, calling the shots in how the strategy should play out. And that's not to say that they're there doesn't need to be collaboration because the relationship doesn't work without collaboration with the client. But the way you execute it, you rely on your own expertise and the expertise of, the members on your team. And yeah, it's a very easy way to destroy a media relationship by always listening to what a business leader, wants to do.
Right. It's almost like a Venn diagram, right? You need
Yeah.
what the media wants, what the company wants, and then kind of what is newsworthy and interesting. And the PR person, I think, when they're doing their role right, is that ambassador, is that equivalent to like the press secretary, right? The White House press secretary has to serve the president, but at the same time has to serve the press corps. And if they alienate one of those two audiences, they're out. Or they're either out or they lose their entire credibility. And so that's a very fine line to balance. And we, as public relations experts and specialists, we have to balance that every day on behalf of our clients and kind of try early and often to kill a story before a client gets too invested in it and thinks it's going to work. And I've seen that happen firsthand where they bring a story idea they're really excited about to the conversation when we meet with them. And then we try to persuade them that it's probably not as interesting as you think it is. And it's almost like they don't hear that, right? They're just like, okay, well, let's go ahead and pitch it and see if it works. And we're trying to respectfully say, I don't think we should pitch this. Therefore, we're not going to pitch it unless there's something to substantiate why this is important.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
No, I was going to say the question that I always, internally ask myself if I am not at that level with the client yet, if, we've been, if the relationship is still fairly new, but the question you should be asking when that, suggestion is made, why should anybody care?
Yeah.
And if you can't answer that question right off the bat, you really don't have a story.
Yeah, totally agree. Why should anybody care? How does it help them? Why does it matter to them? Those are real good questions that everybody should ask. And it's not just because, well, it's important to the company or it's going to help us with sales or, the regional manager wants us to do it, right? Those are all not good reasons. There are good reasons to do some sort of marketing or communication, but I wouldn't count on earned media as the way to do it. In a recent podcast episode, solo cast, that we can link to in here, in the episode notes, I mentioned a term that I heard somebody use, and it was perfect because it was a presentation that was done at the for the automotive industry about PR. But the person said they like to use this acronym called No Gas, which means no one gives a shit, right? And I thought that's great, right? So that was kind of their way internally within their own communication department to give feedback to each other when they're doubling down on a story pitch or content piece that just doesn't, they know in their heart, this doesn't matter to anybody outside our four walls. Right. So they would push back with each other. And that was the acronym they would use is, hey, no gas, right? And if they're marking up a piece of paper, they might just circle a sentence or a paragraph, just put no gas. And so that tells you two things, I think, David. One, scrap it, or two, flip it. So you're focusing on your audience and what's in it for them instead of focusing on looking at yourself in the mirror and reflecting back what you think matters to you.
Yep, exactly.
Well, one of the things we want to talk about is always provide value when communicating with the media. And I just wanted to ask you kind of to give us a little bit more background and description on that.
Yeah. So anytime that I've reached out to the media on behalf of a client, I never want to go empty-handed. And what I mean by that is I'm not just, kind of going back to the self-serving thing. I never just want to say, hey, so-and-so has a really great idea for this. It could really help their company, blah, blah, blah. I always try to look for something that has a unique perspective on a topic that the reporter's covering, something that he or she hasn't heard before, adding a different layer to the overall conversation. And that's where the research comes in, because I've seen it happen time and time again, especially with follow-up emails to reporters. If you're just consistently following up saying, hey, just wanted to touch base if you're interested, and then leave it at that. With my follow-ups, I've always, added a little bit of a nugget of information there. Like, hey, just touching base. Also, I have X, Y, and Z that I think could be beneficial to you and your audience. So when I talk about providing value, it's always about enhancing your communication, not letting it be just a one-way self-serving interaction, but helping the journalists at every chance you get.
Hey, David, you are absolutely correct. And I talk about this all the time with our team, just this idea of, you call it going empty handed. I call it, like we just talked about, adding value, right? And the idea is that, sometimes I'll look at a pitch, somebody asks me to review it, or maybe I'm even working on one myself, and I'll make a note, hey, pull this out and use it for follow-up, right? Because a pitch is nothing more than a teaser. And as you and I have been talking about, sometimes a really good media pitch is just 3 sentences. You just want them to say, tell me more, or I'm interested, or whatever. And then you can start kind of spoon feeding them a little bit of information, almost in sound bites, because 1, that's all they have time for up front. And 2, like you said, that's a fresh way to stay in front of them where you're adding more value to them and helping kind of either passively, aggressively, or intentionally moving the story forward by giving them a little bit more pieces of nugget or pieces of information. And sometimes that might be just, like I said, a little bit more information, a little bit more background. Could be a factoid or statistic. Could be a third party that they could also interview to complete the story. But the one thing I would really tell our audience is, in my experience, the media doesn't really mind when you follow up with them so long as it's helpful. And so long as it's valuable. In fact, we celebrate follow-ups here at the agency. So, people will come forward, like Marjorie on our team will say, you know what, I followed up with this guy 11 times. And on the 11th time, he said, I'm so glad you stayed on top of me about this, because I was interested in the story, but I was on assignment, then I was on vacation, and then the election happened or whatever it might be. And now I'm available and still interested in covering it. And so we celebrate those types of follow-ups because that's a big deal, right? That means in those 7 or 11 times you followed up, you did not frustrate that person. You did not nag them. What you did is each time you came back with a little bit more info and insight. It could be a new research study that was done that freshens up that pitch you sent them a month ago. Could be a further advancement in the topic. It could be that they were mentioned, by some politician in some presentation or something like that just brings it back up to the top of priority list, and you've got to do the job of bringing it back up in their inbox. Right. Have you had experiences like that, David? And what would you recommend to our audience?
Yeah, I've had actually quite a bit. The best thing I can say is, and you kind of alluded to it, always be respectful in your follow-ups. Yes. You have to understand that journalists are receiving, tens of hundreds of pitches a day, depending on their coverage area, the outlet they work at. Sometimes they just don't have time to see everything. And again, if they're on assignment, they're just not going to get to it. So consistent follow-up, and I'm not saying to follow up, every single day. My rule of thumb is always send a pitch, follow up in 48 hours. If I don't hear anything by, the end of the week, then I just send a weekly follow-up. Like, hey, hope everything's well. Try to add as much value as I can in each follow-up, and hopefully, something will happen. I remember there was one pitch I had sent, and it wasn't until, I think it was about 3 months later, that I finally heard from the journalist, and we did a story on that particular pitch. So you never know what can happen. So I think follow-ups are really great for that reason.
Yeah, I totally agree, David. All right. I want to go ahead and take a quick break, and we'll be back on the other side with more with David and more best practices of media relations. We'll be right back.
You're listening to On Top of PR with your host, Jason Mudd. Jason is a trusted advisor to some of America's most admired and fastest growing brands. He is the managing partner at Axia Public Relations, a PR agency that guides news, social, and web strategies for national companies. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to On Top of PR. I'm your host, Jason Mudd with Axia Public Relations. I'm joined by David Triana, my colleague at Axia. We're talking about best practices for media relations and media relationships. And David, we were just talking about following up and always being professional with journalists. I wanted to just share a couple of things. One, my friend Todd, he tells me he follows up depending on the urgency of the story, every 5 days or every 10 days. And one thing I like about that was part of his process is that by following, like you said, you follow up, 24, 48 hours later, and then he just sets it up on a cycle depending on the urgency of the topic or the priority of for him and his client every 5 to 10 days. And he said, when you pick a formula like 5 to 10 days, you're always landing on a different day of the week. And his theory is that, you could be sending this pitch if you follow up every week on Wednesday, and maybe for all you know, that reporter covers the desk on Wednesday or, is off on Wednesdays or something weird like that. So he just hits them up every 5 to 10 days, depending on the priority, but it's one or the other. And he says, even if it's a weekend, he still sends it because sometimes he gets his biggest response on weekend, and news still happens on the weekend. A lot of writers will be covering or assigned or doing something on a weekend anyway.
Right.
And the other thing I want to share with people is that you have to think of the journalist inbox. And Dave, I know this is true, like it's a search engine. And so many times, like you said earlier before the break, you pitched somebody, they went dark, you didn't hear back, and suddenly you heard back. And I can tell you, like, they're like, hey, I knew there was a guy who was following up with me about a cybersecurity expert for, banking and healthcare. And so I just searched my email because this story came up and you came up as the person. So I'm calling you now, right? After a year later, 6 months later, 3 years later, whatever it is, I'm now ready to talk to your expert. And so I think you really have to think about that is like, don't give up just because you didn't get any coverage this month or this quarter, because long-term, eventually they're going to have a need.
Right.
So one more little anecdote I'll share with our audience, and then we'll get back to our questions. And that was one time I had a chief strategy officer at I'll call it a pharmaceutical tech company. And they said to me, hey, I've really messed up. Like, I took on PR in addition to my normal role because nobody here could do it. And we just weren't ready to hire an outside agency. And he said, and everything was going great because I was connecting our experts internally and externally with journalists who were really doctors, right? I was connecting the doctors that are either on our staff or they are, carry our products or providers of our products. Excuse me. And he said, that's been going great. We've been getting coverage like every week. And he said, but I started getting frustrated because I'm spending a lot of my time connecting these journalists with our doctors in-house or our doctors in the field. And all we're getting is a quote. And sometimes they mention our company name and sometimes they don't. And he said, I just was really getting frustrated because the vision was always to have feature stories, either featuring our company, our leadership team, or our products. And it just wasn't happening. So he said, well, here's where I messed up is the next time each of these reporters came to me and wanted to quote one of our doctors, I basically told them, hey, I'm tired of being your editorial assistant and finding all these experts for you. I'm not going to do that anymore until you feature one of our leadership team or one of our products or do a feature story on our company. David, what do you think? How do you think that journalist responded?
Well, I could tell you that dictating the terms is never a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Anytime, and I've had experience with this where either a colleague or just stuff that I've seen written on LinkedIn from journalists and
Yep.
situations that they've been in, I've always said, you're working on the journalist's time. You're like any interaction. I get why that situation could be frustrating, but making that relationship as, mutually beneficial as possible, even if a story doesn't happen right off the bat, even if it takes months, never try to get on the bad side of a journalist. As I said before, they are already overwhelmed as it is. And half the time they are the ones being given a story to write. A lot of these stories are pre-assigned. They're answering to an editor. They're answering to a producer. If you try to say, hey, I'm not going to do this until you do this, not a good idea. But maybe in this situation, it worked out for him. I'm interested to see how it turned out.
Oh, it didn't work out well, David. It didn't work out well at all. But you gave some good insight and valuable advice. So the guy basically told me that those reporters all told him to pound sand and that he had wrecked every relationship he had built over the 3 to 6 months that he was doing this. Yeah. And I told him, I said, what we'll never know is whether or not those people were willing to do that story eventually. And you not having to ask in a way that you asked instead of pitching them the idea. And I kind of tried to ask him, I was like, well, how did you pitch them to do that type of story? Did you bring it up before? And I think he literally just thought they would just do it on their own goodwill and he didn't have to ask for it. It's kind of like, you don't go to a restaurant and hope the waitress comes over and says, hey, would you like a Dr. Pepper now instead of the sweet tea you've been drinking all day? They're not mind readers, right? And so just to finish off the story, we ended up not working with them 100% because he was not willing to pay us to simply rebuild those relationships and get the doctors quoted again. He still was insisting on these feature stories happening. And I said, well, first of all, you're on the bad list, right? Nobody, the journalists don't want to work with you anymore. We've got to repair and mend that relationship, restore it to where it was before, and then more tactfully, I find and pitch good stories that will lead to the feature stories you were originally looking for. But for us just to go to them and start pitching them a feature story, they're going to say, I have a bad taste in my mouth about that company. So they're not inclined to do it. He wasn't willing to make that investment. And I did a little Google search recently and trust me, they're not benefiting from any more media coverage. And, until he changes his mind, he's just never going to have that success. So,
yeah.
The next thing we wanted to talk about was proprietary data as a key differentiator from your competition. Tell me more about that, David.
Yeah. So in a previous agency that I worked with, there was a large focus on data and the clients, trying to find a way within their industry to answer a question or a series of questions that were really plaguing the industry, or there just wasn't a lot of information about. So I've seen that work many times, and I'm sure anybody that's listening, when you read a story, a lot of the time the headline is something along the lines of, study shows XYZ. And if you're the owner of a study like that nobody else has that data, that is incredibly attractive to a journalist, because not only do they have a unique angle with unique information, they have stuff to back it up from you as the source. And that lends a lot of credibility to anything going on in that industry for future opportunities. And it sets you apart from your competition. If, let's say another client, another agency is being pitched on a similar topic, but they don't have that, you do, the journalist is going to go with you more often than not, because you're providing the information that backs up, your assertions. And a lot of the time, that is what makes a really good article, not just, anecdotal information. If you have numbers and statistics to back up what you're saying and what you're bringing to the public, that is gold for a journalist.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think writing a book is also helpful if you're an individual or a thought leader and you want to differentiate yourself from someone else. Is a journalist is going to quote or trust a source that's written a book than a source that hasn't yet done that. And, to your point about having data, the other thing I advise clients a lot is, hey, even though you're a private corporation, if you're willing to act more like a public corporation and announce your earnings, announce your profit, be more transparent about, certain KPIs and metrics that differentiate you, the more substance you're giving to the journalist to cover. If you just say, hey, we're a really fast growing company, but we don't want to tell you how quickly we're growing and we don't want to tell you your revenue. Well, how do they really know you're a fast growing company?
Yeah.
If you say you're fast growing, but you won't disclose your employee headcount, where it was and where it's going, or where it is now, again, there's no substance there. If you want to talk about how you've expanded into a new office, but you won't talk about square footage, again, what's the journalist going to write about? That you're really confident and happy with your growth? That's not a news story, right? But if you can tell a journalist up front, hey, we're looking at new office space. We're currently in 5,000 square feet and we need 15. We're currently in, 250,000 square feet. We're looking for 1 million square feet. Like that kind of substance really helps the journalist, get their arms around a story and be able to tell that story for you.
Absolutely.
The other brand that does a really good job with this is the ADP employment report, right? So that started out as like, and I mention this because I think a lot of our audience will miss this. You often have a lot of valuable data inside your own organization. ADP had payroll data for millions of companies, right? And they realized this gold that they have internally about talking about employment growth. Are companies hiring or not? And by what percentage are they adding jobs? And here they are sitting on a mountain of information and not doing anything about it. So somebody had the smart idea about creating this report. Very similarly, I tell clients, especially those in software and data and things like that, you probably have some data internally that you don't even realize would be valuable to help set a finger on the pulse of the marketplace and the economy and what it's doing. And, their initial reaction is, oh, we can't share that data. It's our customer data. And I said, well, you can share it on a very macro level, right? You don't have to tell me that, Axia Public Relations added 5 employees this month, but you can tell me that generally speaking, PR firms grew by X% this month. And, construction companies grew by this and manufacturing grew by that. That's the type of data that will get journalists excited because you're giving them insight that no one else has. It's relatively fresh data. And I definitely don't think a majority of companies have that kind of data, but a lot of companies might be surprised what they could figure out and finagle that would be interesting either to their profession or to the industry they work in.
Yep.
All right, so we want to talk about respect for ethics and how key that is in journalism. Give me your take on that, David.
Yeah, so I guess the story you told just a few minutes ago is a perfect example. Asking for favors, and I think this is the main issue that a lot of journalists run into, is being pitched a story, and it's predicated on the fact that they may have worked with somebody one time, and they think, oh, I have it locked. They owe me a favor or something. That's just not. That is actually really bad. You're setting a precedent that gives not only a bad name to yourself, but a bad name to the industry. So I think anytime that you're interacting with the media in any respect, be respectful. And ethics is a huge part of that. Just like a journalist is, promising to be ethical by not plagiarizing, being as accurate as possible, and, basically just really defining everything they're doing to a T. And on the publicist side and the industry side in general, we have to do the same thing on behalf of the clients, where we're not trying to, conflate these relationships that we have and, make these promises that, oh, I know this person, we're shooing to get a feature with the New York Times. Not only does that put you in a bad light, but then that gives them the opportunity to say, if you're saying this, I'm not going to work with you, because why are you putting me in the situation where you're telling everybody just because we've worked together one time, I can give you this grand placement that you're looking for. So it all comes down to having common sense when dealing with other people in a professional manner. And that, unfortunately, it happens a lot. So just doing that will easily put you on the good side of a journalist. Even if your pitches aren't landing, they will never blacklist you. They will never say, stop contacting me. They will always be willing to interact with you as long as you remain respectful.
David, I think every journalist is thanking you for sharing that because it's so true, right? Just and I can't imagine. I'd almost love to be a fly on the wall or see that person's face when they have just thought, well, I worked with this journalist once, so I know I can control what they cover in the future, and then have that backfire on them. Probably a rude awakening. But I learned early on when I did the Public Relations Society of America has a program for accreditation in public relations, and they teach you, it's unethical for you to promise to do anything that's outside of your control, right? And so, David, you and I, we do well in PR, but we don't own media outlets yet, right? We're not Jeff Bezos. We're not buying media outlets as we want to. And so if you don't own that media outlet, you cannot control what they're going to do. And you often can't even predict what they're going to do. You can certainly have relationships and collaborations. And if you have enough clout, maybe even negotiate how a story might get covered. But at the end of the day, that's the key thing. And in PR, we are so dependent on third parties and external forces that we would be very foolish to make promises that we can't honor or keep, which would be therefore unethical. Every writer has a boss, every reporter has a boss, every editor, every producer has a boss. And doesn't matter how high up the food chain you get, that somebody has a boss. And at the end of the day, if they have no boss within that organization's four walls, then they report to the board, or they're ultimately accountable to the audience that they serve. And when that audience starts getting disinterested in the type of content they're producing, they will tune away or not come back. And at the end of the day, that's what I think a lot of people are missing, is that journalists are accountable to their editors and their publisher and producers. And those people are accountable to the audience they serve. And so if the audience is going away because they don't like the content or substance, then, they're not going to come back. And so you better believe now in the modern day that journalists and newsrooms can track traffic by article and engagement by article. They're starting to look and see, what do our readers really want to hear about? Now, it doesn't always mean they follow that advice, but at least it's a voice in there. Right. And so I could be the best man at the New York Times editor's wedding, but if I don't bring him or her a story that lands with their audience, that fits their journalistic style or their editorial direction, they're not going to run it. They're not going to run it. And so I think that's what a lot of people mess up. I saw somebody ranting on LinkedIn recently, David. I think you saw it too, where the person was saying, the biggest crock in PR today is when either a PR person promises that they have, 2,000 media contacts or 100 media contacts. Of course, any good PR person is going to have a lot of media contacts. But again, they can't control them or manipulate them or, even pay them off to cover a story, right? It's just not going to happen. So the variable I think a lot of people miss is, no matter how good you are at media relations, you still have to have a good story. And one of the skills of media relations is creating or finding or developing, uncovering that story. But again, I could have every journalist in America could know me, and just because I call them doesn't mean they're going to do whatever I ask or run the story. It's got to check some boxes.
Right.
We want to talk about staying ahead of the news cycle whenever possible, David. And I know one of those things is kind of predicting what's happening, newsjacking. What else should we talk about there?
Yeah. And, before we dive into this, obviously nobody can predict the future. Anything can happen at any moment.
Yep.
But for, the client is the expert in their industry. As much as we can research on our time, they're the ones that are in the weeds and know everything that's going on. So if there's any sense that they can, somewhat forecast something might be coming, or they have just an inclination based on past experiences that a certain thing might happen, I think it is always beneficial to sort of trust that instinct and use that as a way to reach out to a reporter and say, hey, reaching on behalf of so-and-so, current market conditions are showing, based off of his experience, that XYZ might happen. In cases of any interest, let me know and I'd be happy to connect you both. Something like that. And it can happen in a client meeting. It can happen in a quick phone conversation, just, asking for a quick update on how this person is seeing the industry at the moment. A nugget of information like that can lead to something big. And I'm not saying you're going to end up on, CNN as the guy who predicted yesterday's market crash. But maybe it could be, you could be a leading voice in something to that effect. So that's kind of what I mean when I say stepping ahead of the news cycle. Just be ready to pounce on any opportunity. And if you have any insight on what's, might be coming down the line, definitely let your team know.
Yeah, David, that's so true. And, a common mistake I see people making beyond the point you're making, which is, a lot of times you can predict a little bit of the future by looking at editorial calendars, which for those who don't know is when a magazine publishes a list of here are the topics we're going to feature each month for the next 12 months. For a media relations pro, that's like gold, right? That's like, getting the answers to the test ahead of time, right?
Right.
But what a lot of people miss, especially early in their career, especially if they've never worked in news before, is those editorial calendars are meant to give you a heads up of something they're working on, 2 or 3 months ahead of time. So I've seen this happen. It's very sad to watch or hard to watch, but when a PR cub is pitching a story on July 1 that's supposed to run in their July magazine because they saw it in the July editorial calendar. And I'm like, what you don't realize is that magazine went to bed, which is lingo in the industry for, going to print basically, a month or 2, or maybe even 3, depending on the outlet ago. So, with editorial calendars, it's giving you kind of the answers to the test, if you will, ahead of time, but you've got to leverage it very early. And, I don't think there's any such thing as being too early. Like when those lists come out, I just saw one yesterday, which is really early, August, really early to be the release. Usually you're waiting to see those in November or December, or sometimes you have to wait till January. But when you see one and your client or your company's a fit, that's the time to reach out and say, hey, it looks like in your, March issue, you're going to be writing about this. When should I get in touch with you, and who should I get in touch with, and what kind of things are you looking for? Right. Depending on the magazine, especially B2B magazines, they may be saying, hey, we'd like you to write related content to that, and we'll run a bylined article. And that's your chance to pounce. And in my experience, that article should be really good. So they say, hey, why don't you write something for us once a month? Yeah. Kind of thing. So, David, the other thing we wanted to talk about today was making the media's job as simple as possible. We've alluded to this quite a bit, but bring it home for us, David.
Yeah. So this is mainly, honestly, anything you can think of, being available, working with the reporter on their availability. I've always said when we're scheduling interviews or we're working with a reporter on an opportunity, we are on their time. We are following, their rules, their playbook on how everything should go. So always be willing to work with that. And for a publicist, on the PR side, always have a plan B. So I've run into the situation many times where I might have an interview lined up, let's say 2 p.m., and I hear at 1:15, sorry, I'm not going to be able to make it. Now I have completely ruined that opportunity. I'm at risk of losing this relationship because I committed to saying, hey, my client's available here. There are going to be no issues. And then, they cancel. I always have somebody waiting in the wings just in case something like that ever happens. And I have only ever heard good things from journalists whenever something like that occurs, but I have somebody waiting immediately. So much of this is making a really good first impression that defines the longevity of that relationship. And if you're willing to be available, if you're willing to give your availability right off the bat, not only for that day, but that week, maybe the next, things like that are, they set you apart from many others that, you're constantly in this back and forth email exchange trying to solidify details. I've always also tried to handle all the scheduling from the background, not having another thing to add to the journalist's plate. So this could be, if it's a Google Meet interview, I handle the scheduling of that, send the emails, make sure everything is good, and provide phone numbers just as a backup. So anything that you can think of that would be necessary for a troubleshoot situation, definitely do it. It can really mean the difference between that reporter never working with you again and you being the number one choice for a story that they're working on, aside from anybody else they may contact.
Yeah, David, I totally agree with you. You said that very well. There's somebody in our industry who talks about how improvising is like the number one skill you need to be successful in PR, even more so than relationship building. And, I think that that's something a lot of people miss because, what is it? The goal, the plan can change, the goal can't, right? And so the goal is to, build this relationship with the media, get our clients some nice visibility. But the real goal is to maintain those relationships for the long term and not short term. And we've been able in this conversation to talk about ethics. And one of the big things about ethics is always doing what's in the best interest for everybody long term, right? And thinking long term is one of the best ways to, grade your ethical behavior or judge your ethical behavior. Is this something that I'll be glad I did 10 years, 20 years from now? Is this something that somebody could bring up 10 or 20 years from now and I'd be embarrassed by it? And what is the other thing is, the best media pitch a journalist can receive is a story that's already done for them. And what I mean by that, David, and is we're bringing them everything they need. Here's the story. Here's the background. here's 3 experts you can talk to, or 2 experts in a study that was recently done, but you're giving them 3 sources they can use for their story, and you're handing them a visual element that they can use as well. And look at that. I mean, that story to me sounds good already because it's done, right? I don't have to do a lot of chasing and seeking. And I've worked with David before, and he's proven he's reliable. And if he says he's got 3 sources lined up, I believe he does. Now he's just confessed he has a 4th and 5th source, lined up as a plan B kind of thing. And, the visual is very key. And, you and I talked about this, by the way, there's a great quote from Dan Martell that says 80% done by someone else is 100% freaking awesome. Right. And so if we can deliver that 80% from them, they're 80% more likely. I'm making up a statistic on the fly. They're 80% more likely to cover our story than the story that's not already done for them.
Yep.
And, you and I faced an interesting thing back in May where, we had a journalist in Denver ready to do a story about one of our clients in their local locations. And, the client just could not deliver on the things that they thought they could deliver. And, I think we all had to pivot to, come up with a plan B for that and make that work out. And for me, there's nothing worse than having a journalist who wants to do a story and a client who you thought wanted to do a story, but then, can't put together the simple elements to pull that off. So that was certainly disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens. The best thing you can do is just be as prepared as possible on your end. Unfortunately, the situation just might be things don't work out. But if you're at least making the effort and the journalist sees that, I think, you're well on your way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, David, any other closing comments or thoughts? I think we had a great episode here and would just love to see if there's anything else you want to leave behind with our audience to think about.
No, I think just the overall theme of today was, understand that journalists have a hard job to do, same way as, people in the PR industry have a hard job to do. And it's up to us to make each other's jobs easier. So as long as we can do that, be respectful while we do that, I think, that relationship will only get better in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And my summary would be also that, there's a cart before the horse scenario when you're doing media relations. Like you've got to have your story all lined up so a journalist can give you a clear yes or no answer. And just because you had your story all lined up and you did all your work doesn't mean they're going to say yes. Right. And I think setting that expectation with your colleagues or your superiors, make sure they understand that too, is really important, because the last thing you want is them to just automatically perceive or you to paint a picture for them that it's going to happen. Then it doesn't happen and they're upset that they made a sacrifice of time, energy, and effort. So I think that's important too, is just to understand that it's a very flexible environment we're in when we're doing media relations. There's an old cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. And, if there's a more newsworthy story, and we'll put a link to the 10 elements of news in the episode notes. If one of those 10 elements ranks higher than the elements that you're pitching, then you're going to be disappointed. And, one last anecdotal I'll end on, David, is I remember one time our client was giving away a really big check. We had, 3 local news vans in the parking lot who were going to, cover it. And I think one was even going to go live because it was a pretty big check. And all of a sudden I see these news trucks just put in reverse and backing out and leaving. Reporters who are already inside are walking out. And I grabbed one and I said, "Hey, what's going on? Where's everybody going?" They're like, "There's a hostage situation down the street. We're the closest news crew to that situation. We're being rerouted there." Yep. There's not a lot you can say in that moment. Well, aren't you going to stick around and watch our pre-planned check presentation? Of course not, right? They're gone. And the sooner they get there, the better. So, my point is that you can even have, journalists in your hands ready to write your story, and something can change at a moment's notice. And you've just got to learn to pivot and improvise.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
David, I'm really glad we did this. Thank you for sharing your smarts and insights, as well as your experience with our audience today. If they want to connect with you, David, give them, your preferred way, maybe your email address. They can
Sure. Yeah. So my email is dtriana, that's DTRIANA at axiapr.com. Happy to help you with anything you need. The team here at Axia is great, and I'm sure we can help you with all of your PR needs. So thanks again, Jace, for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad we did this. I think We both, I know I learned something. Hope you learned something too. And I know for sure our audience will learn something as well, because there's always ways to just get 1% better every day in your PR efforts. And sometimes you hear a little reminder or something, gosh, I already knew that, but I'm not doing that. And those are some of my favorite nuggets. So, well, with that, we say thank you to David for joining our episode today. And thank you for tuning in to On Top of PR, where our goal is to help you stay on top of PR. If you have a friend or colleague in the business that you think would benefit from this episode, please do us a favor and share it with them, either on your social media or through a DM of some sort. I'm sure they'll thank you for sending it to them. And we will thank you as well for helping to spread the word about our podcast. If you have any particular requests on topics you'd like to hear more about, please drop us an email at podcast@axiapr.com or podcast@ontopofpr.com. With that, this is Jason Mudd signing off, wishing you well, and thank you for listening.
This has been On Top of PR with Jason Mudd, presented by ReviewMaxer. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and check out past shows at ontopofpr.com.